This week's episode of our show has been sponsored by Dungeon Fog.
Dungeon Fog's web-based map-making platform is perfect for any dungeon master looking to create their own custom maps.
Using Dungeon Fog, you can create gorgeous homebrew battle maps from multi-level dungeons to natural environments and much, much more.
You can export high-res maps to print or use on a virtual tabletop, or even send a Fog of War version to a TV or projector.
A premium subscription includes over 3,000 high-resolution map-making assets with dozens more added every month.
Follow the links in the description below or visit dungeonfog.com to try it out for your next game.
And now, on to this week's episode. Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Callie McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything Dungeons & Dragons, including advice for players and guides for Dungeon Masters.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Now, it's no small secret that when running Dungeons & Dragons, or any other tabletop role-playing game, there's a lot of important rules that are in the books itself. But it's no small secret that for everything that is in these books, there's a lot of things that the books don't explain and don't tell you how to do.
There are a lot of nuances to the game of Dungeons & Dragons that rely on assumptions made that lay outside of the rules presented in these books. And although there are a lot of social contracts and social obligations that do fall into this category as well, that's not what we're going to be discussing today. Instead, we want to look at some of the mechanical features that are important to know that might not be represented properly within the pages of these books.
By understanding these unspoken rules of the game, we can actually make the rules work a little bit better for us as both players and dungeon masters. There's a lot to discuss, so let's get rolling.
So to start, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is a game that is played from levels 1 to 20. Now, if you look at a lot of the modules presented, the way that leveling works in Dungeons & Dragons and several other elements, you might notice that there is actually a very defined sweet spot that a lot of the creators of D&D already know about, but you might not, and that sweet spot is between the levels of 5 and 10, where the real magic of Dungeons & Dragons happens.
Even though Dungeons & Dragons stretches all the way from level 1 to 20, and many house rules and indeed rule supplements in prior editions have allowed player characters to achieve levels higher than level 20, in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition quite specifically, the game mechanics seem to work their best between levels 5 and 10. These are levels of the game where the expectations on what player characters can accomplish, the types of monsters that they can face, and indeed, the just fantasy of the worlds of Dungeons & Dragons is best encapsulated. In fact, the game has probably been playtested more extensively between the levels of around level 4 to 11 than any other level.
You might notice when you're setting up to play Dungeons & Dragons that those first few levels, most monsters actually pose a significant threat of death to low-level characters. And once your character reaches levels 17, 18, 19, 20, you are basically punching gods in the face without sweating about it. As soon as you hit level 5, you can feel the power of your character come online. It's where you get your extra attacks or your special features that really define the classes of Dungeons & Dragons. And between 5 and 10 is when you really get to explore what your character's made of.
A lot of fantasy fiction fits best within what happens in a D&D game between level 5 and 10. And a lot of the media that we tend to consume as inspiration for Dungeons & Dragons doesn't really line up with the kinds of capabilities or adventures that happen in higher level Dungeons & Dragons. So it is important to note that the characters feel most grounded and like the expectations of the game are best delivered. That's not to say that high level Dungeons & Dragons is not possible to balance, nor is it not fun. It is awesome. But you do have to kind of shift your expectations a little about what the game is going to be like at those higher levels of play. We've seen a lot of data come out from websites like D&D Beyond that indicate that a lot of D&D campaigns tend to peter out after that point. And the fact that the official modules so rarely go beyond level 13 really is galvanizing, I think, a big part of our D&D community towards this sweet spot of D&D. And the higher levels feel a little bit undersupported and neglected.
Once you pass that level 10 mark, you should expect to put a little more effort into trying to challenge those players, and also expect them to possibly destroying combat encounters with their amazing super heroic abilities.
One of the other unspoken design conceits of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition that actually sets it quite wildly apart from previous editions, particularly 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons, is that in D&D 5e, player characters, NPCs, and monsters don't play by the same rules. Basically, the rules for creating a non-player character, and when a Dungeon Master makes an NPC, you don't have to use the player character rules for building NPCs. In fact, all of the templated NPCs in the Monster Manual and Volo's Guide to Monsters were not built necessarily by using the same rules as player characters. They were built by using the monster design rules, which worked very differently.
One thing that's important to note when you're looking at creating an NPC or monster versus a player character is that the guidelines put in place in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons for player characters are there to keep them grounded in a form of progression that makes sense as they move through an adventure or campaign setting. Whereas your monsters can actually manipulate and change these rules in ways that would be too powerful for a player character to wield, but might make sense as a tool for world building, storytelling, and narrative explanation within your game.
Now, there is something to be said for the verisimilitude that is gained by having NPCs, monsters, and players kinda sorta use the same rules. After all, they draw from the same spell lists and use the same spells, and everyone has AC and hit points. The capabilities of NPCs can often be individually much higher than the capabilities of a player, even though they're facing each other. Here's a really great example of this. The challenge rating 12 Archmage in the Monster Manual is capable of casting 8th and 9th level spells, but they're challenge rating 12 and are an appropriate challenge for player characters that are level 12 and only have access to level 6 spells. The NPC Gladiator is roughly the equivalent of a 18th level fighter, but is a challenge rating 5 NPC adversary. In Volo's Guide to Monsters, there is a challenge rating 7 NPC Warlock who can cast Finger of Death and Feeble Mind. So it's actually quite appropriate and fine for NPCs of pretty low challenge rating to have really powerful spells and abilities that the player characters won't be able to access till a much higher level. Another great example of this is an NPC Necromancer who can raise an entire army of undead. That's an ability that's totally fine for a villain to have, but might not necessarily be appropriate for a player to have, at least as a willy-nilly ability. Maybe that's a big power that they have to spend a lot of resources and time to gain on their own.
Now, when we are talking specifically about the spells of Dungeons & Dragons, you should keep in mind that not all spells are created equal. When we look at the Archmage, which is challenge rating 12 and can cast 9th level spells, they have Time Stop as their big spell. If you gave them Meteor Swarm instead, that is a whole different story because you could party wipe a group of level 12 characters with that. So it is important to note the power of the spells that you are giving your NPCs because that can drastically change their power level as well. And some spells work really, really well and are really fun for a DM to use against the party that might actually be boring for the party to use. And also, the party can use some really powerful spells to totally undo a combat encounter that you might want to be careful giving to your NPCs and monsters.
On the flip side, there are certain rules and constraints for spells that make a lot of sense for player characters, but you can actually unleash this for NPCs. For example, there's been several adventures created over the history of Dungeons & Dragons that featured NPC wizards who had multiple clones or multiple simulacrums. These are things that would probably not be appropriate for the player characters to ever have, but are totally fine if the NPCs can do these sorts of things because that is under the discretion and control of the Dungeon Master. Now, of course, this isn't an invitation for a Dungeon Master to go on a total power trip and make NPCs that are wildly inappropriate and unfair for the player characters to face. It still requires discretion and intelligence, but it actually means that with discretion and intelligence, the Dungeon Master can break the rules in very careful and intentional ways in order to design the adventure that they need.
Now, a lot of people hear things like this and they do get worried that perhaps this is going to shatter the reality of what D&D is presenting. But the fact is that D&D is not a simulator. D&D is an abstract, exception-based rule system. So we need to look kind of at what our discretion is as a DM and how we can implement the sort of abstract nature of the rules of D&D.
Dungeons & Dragons has a very pulpy cinematic feel to it, and it does a pretty poor job, especially 5th edition D&D, of being anything close to a reality simulator or capturing reality in any sort of perfect way. It is abstract because it is meant to generate cool things and cool scenarios and create more of an impression in your mind or an idea. Central to this is that Dungeons & Dragons relies on a dungeon master. It relies on a human being making good judgments and using their reason and their own sense of logic to be the arbiter of how the game world works. These rule books don't produce something that can be easily translated into a video game style simulation. That's why it's been so hard to have a very good Dungeons & Dragons video game that doesn't compromise on so many of the things that make Dungeons & Dragons magical. The free form and interpretive lens that you only gain by having a dungeon master. So rather than feel like that is a constraint, it's something that we actually have to lean into it as well.
One of the things that we love about Dungeons & Dragons is the ability to do anything, which is really what separates it from video games. In video games, you're limited by where the designers put walls or what your dialogue options are. But in the worlds of Dungeons & Dragons, the dialogue options are endless. The walls don't exist. You can blow them up. You can jump over them. You can break them down. And that is why we love Dungeons & Dragons. The rules for Dungeons & Dragons often explain how things should work, but they never say that things can't work. And that's where you as a dungeon master need to step in and decide where the line is on what will and won't work within your worlds. And that's where you become the most important asset that separates Dungeons & Dragons from just being a stack of rules into something much more magical.
At the same time, because Dungeons & Dragons is an exception-based rule system, and it is something that is abstract, we also have to rely on that good judgment in logical ways. The rules of Dungeons & Dragons don't say that a human player character can't have 6 arms, and that they can't have 2 heads. It's kind of assumed that you know that. There's nowhere written that it says you can't have 6 arms. They assume that you're going to use the rules in a slightly logical and well-balanced way and rely on the dungeon master to make the final call on what is and is not possible, because the rules will always be an abstraction that can't totally capture the full range of things that might be possible.
This also works the other way as well, where some of the rules will dictate the way certain things work that don't necessarily make sense logically. For example, if you have 2 ways to up your AC. Maybe you have natural armor, but you're also wearing half plate. You could make the argument that, well, just because you're putting on half plate doesn't mean that your skin is any thinner. But we need to look at the rules-based system of D&D that let it be a game and make sure that we're falling in line with what is fair and what makes sense for the game itself. And that's where you look at some of the rules and use those to dictate the reality in a rules-based system.
Fundamentally, the rules of D&D are built around a gigantic abstraction, which is the hit point system, which, whether you want to call hit points meat points or stamina or anything else like that, however you slice it, it's an abstraction. No human-sized person could ever survive a direct hit from a giant wielding an axe. So when we resolve an attack of that fire giant attacking your fighter, we know that even though you hit and took damage, it obviously wasn't anything that could ever happen in real life, because if a fire giant hit a real person in real life with an axe, that person would be very, very dead. If you try to make the rules of Dungeons & Dragons feel super realistic, they're gonna let you down.
While we're discussing what the rules do offer in these books, there is actually one rule that we think is still unspoken because so many people miss this rule that is written on page 263 of the Dungeon Master's Guide. And this is the idea that while you have the option to homebrew and house rule all you want, there are certain elements that can be really, really tricky to mess around with. And that is the action economy, concentration, or magic item attunement. And the DMG actually states that these are 3 things that you should try to avoid touching.
The Dungeon Master's Guide says, beware of adding anything to your game that allows a character to concentrate on more than one effect at a time, use more than one reaction or bonus action per round, or attune to more than 3 magic items at a time. Rules and game elements that override the rules for concentration, reactions, bonus actions and actions, and magic item attunement can seriously unbalance or overcomplicate your game. The irony of all this is that the rules of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition already have exceptions to this. Fighters have action surge, there's time stop, and the haste spell. If you cast Bestow Curse or Major Image at a higher level, those spells no longer require concentration, so you can have those spells in effect while concentrating on another spell. And the Artificer in the Eberron books can attune to more than 3 magic items at a time. But these are all exceptions to those rules that have been carefully considered, not necessarily just loosey-goosey applied.
So if you are setting out to make your own house rules or you're homebrewing some sort of campaign setting, these are the 3 rules that we're not saying you can't or shouldn't touch, but they should be the last options that you look at for actually changing. And if you are thinking of changing them, be very careful and aware that even the Dungeon Master's Guide does state that this is dangerous waters and that there is a chance of directly imbalancing your game by messing around with these components.
One of the things that you'll notice about many things that do make exceptions to these rules, such as potions of flight and invisibility and speed that give the effects of the fly, invisibility, and haste spells without concentration, or things like the fighter's action surge or the time stop spell, is that all of these are limited use abilities. They require the characters to either put a spell into effect, use a very limited spell slot, or something that only gains back on a short rest. And they're all very, very specifically grounded in certain ways. So when the rules make an exception, they do so very carefully.
The concentration mechanics and the magic item attunement mechanics are 2 that are argued a lot for being too restricting to player characters. And yes, I can imagine as a player character how amazing it would be to concentrate on 2 spells. But you need to take into account the options that actually presents you if you were able to do that consistently, and how unbalanced the game could become. As a player character, I would love to be able to fly while invisible, casting Wall of Force and Cloud Kill all at the same time. It sounds like the most badass magic user I could ever imagine. But the fact is that that's going to make it really, really hard for the DM to actually challenge me. And that is what we need to take into account, is that these rules are in place to create a balance in the game that allows the Dungeon Master to present reasonable threats to the party without them being able to break the game by having 18 magic items. We're not Link from The Legend of Zelda, where we can just pull out 50 magic items from our pocket, changing them on a whim in the middle of combat. It's just unreasonable to imagine doing that in the worlds of D&D.
Now, of course, when we mention this topic of balance, which comes up a lot of times, I think the most important element of balance that people forget about is that it's not about the player characters facing balanced combat encounters. It's not about even the player characters having a fair balance between what they're capable of. This is not a player versus player thing. One of the biggest and most disruptive problems in game balance in Dungeons & Dragons as a whole is how much work gets thrown on the Dungeon Master to solve the problems of the rules. And when Dungeons & Dragons gets unbalanced, it creates a bunch of problems that the Dungeon Master has to fix and solve in order to make their game consistent and playable and something that they can manage at the table. That's the risk of an unbalanced game. Not any sort of inequity between the player characters or the fact that they might face combat encounters that are too easy or too difficult. No. The Dungeon Master is the weakest link in this whole thing, and a stressed out, overworked, burned out Dungeon Master is the last thing that anyone wants to have, because without a DM, you don't have a game. And if a DM is tearing their hair out over coming up with an adventure and balancing encounters, then that's when the game is having a problem.
And while we discuss stressed out dungeon masters, One thing that can stress out a dungeon master more than anything else is when they are trying to create their own campaign, and the idea that they're going for is something that does not lend itself to the high fantasy elements of Dungeons and Dragons. There are a lot of people out there who are very interested in playing different types of settings within the worlds of Dungeons and Dragons. And because we all love and know Dungeons and Dragons, a lot of DMs set out with this idea of let's make a really grounded and gritty D&D setting, or let's make a setting that's cyberpunk, or maybe one that is a horror story, murder mystery, or possibly something that's a low magic setting where everybody just plays a regular person, or a very high magic setting where you are the Avengers or superheroes or things of that nature. But we need to keep in mind what Dungeons and Dragons is at its core, and that although it can lean in certain directions, if you are trying to create a setting that doesn't fit the scenarios that Dungeons and Dragons excels at, you might want to look elsewhere.
Dungeons and Dragons, fundamentally, as part of its core DNA, is a game about high fantasy heroes in pulp action sort of scenarios, diving into dangerous and exotic environments where they battle horrific monsters and take their stuff. Now, within that model, there's a lot of room for things like political intrigue, building strongholds, going to war, and doing interesting role-playing and even different settings, ones that modify the amount of magic in the world. Everything from Dark Sun to Eberron, and even convincing applications of worlds like Middle-earth and Westeros. But there is a breaking point where the rules of Dungeons & Dragons just won't capture the idea that you as a dungeon master want to achieve. And some dungeon masters immediately set out to make a ton of house rules to make the square peg that is Dungeons & Dragons fit into a triangular hole.
I was hesitant to branch out to any other system because I had spent a long time learning and researching and understanding D&D. And I said to myself, well, I'm comfortable with this. I'm comfortable with D&D, and I don't really feel confident in branching out to another gaming system. And I thought it would be a neat idea to write a Halloween one-shot that was a bunch of teens that go to a cabin in the woods and get assaulted by a murderous monster that they then have to escape from and kill in the end. It sounded like a really cool idea, and I started writing out all of these rules. And everybody was going to play a human. I changed the classes a little bit so that they didn't seem as medieval fantasy and were more real world. I tried to implement rules using the systems for firearms or other elements. I tried to balance it out so that the monster was something that would threaten them, but that they couldn't kill immediately. And after months of trying this out, I heard about Monster of the Week, and somebody got me the book, and I read through it and said, oh yeah, this is 100% what I was going for. Why did I struggle so hard to try to make D&D this thing that it just wasn't able to fit into? I have done this a number of times with trying to come up with a new way to use D&D to try something a little different when somebody has already done that work for me. And I think the other major element here is after playing several rounds of Monster of the Week, I actually picked up elements, lessons, and skills from playing that game that I was able to bring back to D&D, and it improved certain elements of the game for me even more so. So I think by branching out, don't be afraid to look at other systems. Don't be afraid to try things, and it's actually going to make you better as a dungeon master when you come back to D&D, and it might give you a nice vacation to try something that you maybe were interested in, but had never considered branching out to a new rule set.
Dungeons and Dragons excels at certain things, and it has a lot of flexibility to it. But Blades in the Dark does fantasy heists better. If you are trying to capture the true style of a horror author like H.P. Lovecraft, well, Call of Cthulhu was built from the ground up to deliver on that sort of thing. If you want to set your game in the future with science fiction technology, well, there's a ton of different versions of all the various Warhammer 40,000 role-playing games, and other excellent games like Cyberpunk and much more that have been well built and well constructed to handle these sorts of things. So it does behoove you to look at these other systems, and I think Kelly is completely right in that sometimes playing a different RPG that isn't D&D gives you a fresh idea of what the mechanics of D&D do really, really well, and give you things that you can draw on when you are running games of Dungeons & Dragons too. Sometimes the best advice about running Dungeons & Dragons is actually found in books that aren't about Dungeons & Dragons completely. I learned so much from reading the Cypher System rule books or from reading the Powered by the Apocalypse various rule books. So it's really, really interesting to look at outside the box of Dungeons & Dragons and see other ways that you can broaden your horizons in that way. And I found a newfound respect and adoration for that fantasy game that is about pulpy heroes fighting horrible monsters. I leaned into that really, really heavily, and my games have been better for it.
So looking back at all the things we talked about today, we hope that you found this video interesting. I'm not going to lie, Monty and I actually spent a lot of time trying to decide if this was a series of separate videos, because they were all points that we felt were interesting to talk about, but we didn't really know how they fit in. The goal here is that we're not saying that you need to abide by the rules that we just mentioned. As a matter of fact, the major point is that these are just ideas and concepts to help you broaden your horizons on what is in the rule books of Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons is obviously one of our favorite things to do. It's our favorite game in the whole world, and we love playing it. And along the way, we hope that we've learned a few things that can benefit anybody who's coming into this game and maybe hasn't thought of these things or maybe hasn't experienced things the same way we have. So we hope that this video helps you out with thinking outside of the box and taking these things into mind when you're setting forth on your D&D adventures in your own campaign setting or in one of the pre-written modules. And just keep in mind to have fun the way that works the best for you and to use your best discretion and intelligence as a dungeon master to make the game amazing for you and your players and have so much fun playing D&D.
These are just a few of those things that we felt the rules just don't communicate very clearly. Of course, there's a ton of stuff as well about running Session 0 and the social contracts and how to manage the social dynamic of a role-playing game group, and we've talked about that a lot in our other videos on Session 0 and Principles for Players. So if you're interested in the social dynamics and the social rules that surround Dungeons & Dragons, check those videos out as well. They're filled with a lot of useful advice as well.
So this has been a look at the Unspoken Rules in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Tell us about any unspoken rules that you live by at your table in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the generosity and incredible help of our Patreon supporters, many of whom helped us in our monthly Writers Room chat on our Patreon-only Discord to actually put this episode together. So a big thank you to all the patrons who joined us in the Writers Room last month to help generate ideas for this episode. If you enjoy the work that we create here on YouTube and want to get more involved with what we do on the channel, please consider checking us out on Patreon by following the links in the description below.
Don't forget to check out our live play Shadows of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern at twitch.tv/dungeon_dudes. You can find all the previous episodes of that campaign right up over here.
And we've got plenty more tips and tricks for Dungeon Masters running games of D&D 5e right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
In the dungeon.